So let me talk about the topic today. So my topic is the economic impact of British rule in India. So why are we discussing this topic? I mean, aren't there better topics to discuss? So the background is that I happened to see a video which actually was quite popular. This was a video by Shashi Tharoor on British reparations for their cruel and unjust rule of India. That is a very interesting video. In fact, there are 2-3 videos on the same topic. Shashi Tharoor first participated in a debate in Oxford University in UK, where he debated this topic and tried to prove that the British rule in India was exceedingly cruel, unjust, exploitative, all of that. And then that became a viral hit, and then he decided to write a book on that. And the book's title is Inglorious Empire. And there have been several other videos where Shashi Tharoor has explained this topic. So I think that video was actually very popular. This whole set of videos were very popular. And what struck me was that 95% of what Shashi was saying, I thought was exactly right. I thought it was very interesting and very good. But I felt a little uncomfortable that there were some aspects that I thought were perhaps not the way I would have thought about it. And it also disturbed me a little that some of his speeches were being celebrated by the extreme right-wing factions of India, who were, I thought, they were trying to portray a picture that India was a glorious and wonderful nation until the British came. And just like that, within 200 years, India just collapsed into insignificance. So that I thought was a very unusual situation, and I thought that was somewhat not the way I would have wanted things to be presented. So I conducted a little more research on this topic and did a lot of reading. And what I'm trying to present to you is a few thoughts that people hold about the British rule in India. And I'm trying to present to you what I have found through my research over the last few weeks. I do not at all pretend to be an expert in history or economics. These are just things that I have observed, and I'm completely open to refutation and to further research. And I apologize if any of this is factually not right, and I'm willing to correct and make changes. So having said all that, let me go and try to share my screen. Okay, let me know if anyone is not able to see my PowerPoint slide, the first slide. And if I don't hear from you, I assume that you can see my slide. So as I said, my title is Economic Aspects of British Rule in India, Fact versus Fiction. So I'm trying to present to you a few thoughts that I think are popularly held, and I'm trying to examine them to see are they really accurate. So with that, let me go to my first slide. My first slide is, I just want to make it clear that I'm not discussing the moral or ethical aspects of British rule. That's not open for debate. I think all of us agree that colonialism is fundamentally unjust, and that's not something to be debated. I'm not here to talk about whether colonialism is good or bad. That's absolutely not my topic. My topic is on a very limited sliver of information. That is, given that colonialism is bad, was it financially and economically good for India? That's all that we are trying to talk about. Okay, I just want to put that caveat. And the last point I'm adding here, which is that British policy has, even though colonialism was unjust and cruel in many respects, we should also recognize that there were some aspects of good that British did, such as banning sati, banning child marriage, and things like that. Now, one could argue if the British had not done that, would these not have happened on their own? Yes, that's a very fair point, true. But I just wanted to list these as things that I'm not going to cover in my presentation. So with that, let me go to my first topic. So I'm putting this as a question of fact or fiction. It is commonly believed that Britain colonized India because they wanted to get the raw materials from India, like cotton and things like that. and they wanted to sell us their manufactured products like cloth. Is this right? This is a commonly held belief? And if you look at Shashi Tharoor's book, I got a sense that this is one of the premises that he's operating in. So I think we need to look at, is this really right or wrong? So with that, let me tell you what is my conclusion. My view is that that's certainly not true. The British rule in India began almost half a century before Industrial Revolution began. As you know, the British rule in India began with the Battle of Plassey in 1757, whereas the Industrial Revolution began towards 1800s. And even though a lot of the factory setup began by 1800s, true date for the start of Industrial Revolution is considered to be the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon was defeated in Battle of Trafalgar, then in Battle of Waterloo, and eventually with the end of Napoleon, the entire political situation in Europe changed a lot. You could say that the end of Napoleon is the date when Britain truly began to rule the world. And that date is commonly held to be 1815. So in many ways, 1815 is the date when British industrial empire really took off. So that's such a long time after Britain began to rule India, parts of India through Battle of Plassey. And look at when the British first came to India. The British East India Company was actually set up in 1600. 1600, think of it. So more than 2 centuries before Industrial Revolution. So the idea that Britain came to India as an opportunity to get raw materials or to sell products is absolutely not true. Having said that, let's just think of what are the different time periods under British rule. This is my own representation. I'm not, again, pretending that this is the very scientific view, but in my layman's way of looking at it, for the first 150 years, British were traders. And then for 30 years after the Battle of Plassey and Battle of Buxar, they began to rule parts of Bengal, Odisha, parts of the East India. And that was a really bad time. That's when they were looting things, they were taking away things. It was fairly cruel and oppressive rule. And then came the more steady state East India Company rule from 1788, which went on until the First War of Indian Independence, 1857 revolt, also called the Sepoy War. And then from 1858, you have the British Raj, when the British Crown directly ruled India. So just wanted to lay that there as a background context here. One thing I would like to point out is that according to most observers, 1757 to 1787 were really the dark years, 30 years when really bad things happened in India. But you should not say India as a whole, because Britain was not ruling India as a whole at that time. And having said that, I should also say when I say Britain, what I mean actually is East India Company. They did not really rule out all of India. They were really ruling Bengal and adjoining areas, just a tiny part of India. And from 1788, the British rule in India actually changed very significantly, as I think we will go through in the remaining slides. So that's just an overview of the timelines. Having said that, let me just point out some key timelines again and key activities in the British rule. One interesting thing that I learned myself, and I don't know if you guys have thought through this, is that the great Mughal Empire of India actually crumbled and collapsed within a space of 25 years. I don't know if this is a very popularly held view, but this is actually quite astonishing. So as you know, Aurangzeb died in 1707. Until then, the Mughal Empire was one of the greatest empires of medieval world, late medieval, early modern world. So 1707, Mughals were amazingly strong, extremely strong, one of the strongest in the world. But 1739, Nadir Shah, this guy from Iran, came and attacked Delhi, and he completely crushed Delhi. There was no chance for any Mughal soldiers to oppose this guy at all. It was a completely one-sided battle. Nadir Shah just crushed Delhi, and he killed tens of thousands of people in Delhi. Such a one-sided victory was actually quite astonishing, given how powerful the Mughals were, which means that even when Aurangzeb was alive, the Mughal Empire was actually very weak internally. And it's just that the weakness was not seen externally, and people were seeing the trappings of Mughal rule and thinking it's strong. But in 1739, they actually just collapsed. And then in 1757, the Battle of Plassey is when Britain got control over Bengal. And 1764, the Battle of Buxar is when they officially became the Diwani of Bengal. And you can say that the true British rule is actually 1764 and not 1757. But thereafter, it's been British rule. So very curious idea about how the Mughal Empire and all of Indian wealth and power just crumbled within a short span of time. The rest of it, I think some of you might be familiar with the remainder of the timelines here. So that is my first point about fact or fiction. Let me go to the next one. Fact or fiction. The Europeans came to India after the Mughal Empire became weak. Is that true? It's a very commonly held belief. So if you look at some of the right-wing Sanghi propaganda, they say that first the Islamic invaders came, then the Mughals came, and then the British came. That's the way. Then the Europeans came. That's the way they say. So here is the fact. The fact is that Europeans actually arrived and started ruling parts of India way before the Mughals even came here. So something called the State of India, Portuguese Estado da India, was set up, right in 1505, and then they began to control Goa from 1510. So imagine asking a Portuguese guy at that time, what do you think of the Mughal rule? The reality, there is no Mughal rule there. It was still Vijayanagara Empire in South India and so on. There was no Mughal rule. I think most people don't realize that Mughals actually came after the Europeans. And here is a slide that I took many, many hours to create, just trying to superimpose the European events on the top row in that slight pinkish reddish row, and the Indian dates on the bottom row. And what I'm trying to communicate here, and I must apologize, this is too dense and you might not get it. What I'm trying to communicate here is that many of the things that we think of as traditional historic Indian things that you see on the bottom rows actually happened after many European events on the top rows. Like, for example, the thing that I would find astonishing, like Melpattur Narayana Bhattadri, the guy who wrote Narayaniyam, or Poondanam, Jnanapana author Poondanam. Poondanam died in 1640. And if you read the works of Poondanam, Jnanapana, or if you read Narayaniyam, these are among the purest and most popular expressions of religious belief in Hindu Kerala, right? But look at their time. Look at the timing. The Kannur fort was set up in 1503. Goa was ruled by the Portuguese by 1510. The Mattanjeri Palace was built in 1555. The Udayam Perur Synod, which created the rift between traditional Kerala Christians and the Catholics from Portuguese, happened in 1599. These are huge events that are European driven that happened half a century, 1 century, 2 centuries ago before Poondanam. But if you read Poondanam and Melpattur and so on, you do not get the sense that these guys are living in a world where European presence in Kerala and European presence in India was already a reality. But you don't get that sense. You get a feeling that there is an ageless, timeless, sort of permanent, traditional Indian setup that you see in their writings. The other example that I think some other people have commented upon is the death of Saint Tyagaraja, the great music composer. He's the doyen of Carnatic music. He died in 1847. That is an astonishingly modern time. This is not a guy who lived 5 centuries ago. This is the guy who lived just less than 2 centuries ago. So he lived after so many other things had happened. I think people have observed how Carnatic music uses violin, and the violin actually came here through the French and British, who were actively present in Tamil Nadu, since the 1700s. So again, we don't need to go through this in detail, but I think the point I'm trying to make is that the European presence here is actually way older than most people believe. Next one. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757 and the Battle of Buxar in 1764, the British looted a lot of wealth from Bengal. That's a popular belief. Is that true? The answer is yes, it's very true. So 1739, as I was saying, is the time when Nadir Shah crushed Delhi, and it was like complete chaos, destruction, bloodshed, and it was a terrible time in Delhi, and just showed how astonishingly the Mughal Empire just collapsed. Soon after that came Battle of Plassey, 1757, where the British took this victory against Indians. And while I was doing this thing, I came across this interesting story that Clive and the French supporters of the Nawab were almost equally matched. It was not like the British were overwhelmingly strong at that time. Now, the British were overwhelmingly stronger than the Nawab, that's true. But the Nawab actually had French supporters. So the French supporters of the Nawab and the English were not very unequal. They were sort of fairly matched. But through some minor logistical question, like you can see this thing about the tarpaulin, Clive had used tarpaulins to cover his gunpowder. It was raining over there, so his gunpowder did not get wet. But the French supporters of the Nawab, who had the same gunpowder, but they did not have tarpaulin, so it got wet and they could not fight properly, was one of the decisive moments in the war, it seems. So we were talking about, did the British loot India after that? Yes, the answer is yes. The British took large gifts from the Nawabs. They called it gifts. Of course, it is just theft, but it was called gifts. And Clive, who was the leader of the British at that time, took a lot of wealth. By the way, Clive is actually one of the most colorful characters in British India. Clive was a guy who practically ruled India, and went back to England as one of the wealthiest people of England at the age of 35. So he is like the Mark Zuckerberg of the English Times, an incredibly wealthy guy, but astonishingly young. And he was a man with great bravery, used to fighting against great odds. Where others would give up in battles, this guy would just bravely go and fight. And that's how he was able to win India for the British. So quite an astonishing guy, this guy, Clive. So he became very rich as a result of this. In fact, the British loot and theft from Bengal in that time, 1750s and 60s, was so bad that Warren Hastings, who was at that time, I think the regent, not the regent, I'm trying to remember the term, he was actually posted in Bengal at that time. And he had to actually write to his bosses in London saying, please stop this. I mean, we are cheating and looting this country, which is again very unusual for an East India Company person to have to say that. And in 1765, as I said, East India Company received the Diwani of Bengal, which means that they formally became the tax collector for Bengal. And Clive reported to his bosses that this is incredible good news. We are almost going to get half the revenue that we take from Bengal is going to be profit for us. I think he has given a letter where he says the revenue from Bengal is 270 lakhs. After all expenses, we'll have a profit of 122 lakhs. Whereas the previous Nawab would use that 122 lakhs to build palaces and to have servants and to have wonderful food and have great dresses and all that. These guys would just take the money back to UK. That's the difference here. So that's what they declare as a theft. The extra profit from the Nawab, from the Bengali treasury, would actually go to England. So that was the area where the English really got rich. Next one. If you look at some of the right-wing propaganda in India, you would understand that there's a lot of dislike of the fact that the British were using their presence in India to spread Christianity. That's a very popular belief. Now, what I found from my reading was that the British were actually opposed to all religious presence in India from 1600 until 1813. For more than 2 centuries, British were very careful not to bring religion into India. In fact, they had a policy since 1662 that where religious preaching in India was actually forbidden, and that changed only after 1813, where the British presence was much more strong, and they had practically conquered most parts of India. In fact, there is a comment here at the bottom, if you notice. There is something called the Vellore Mutiny of 1806, and the British leaders actually took the lessons that the Vellore Mutiny actually happened because the British were trying to interfere with Indian customs. So I think the Vellore Mutiny was one where the local people of Vellore, of Tamil Nadu, were actually told, you should not wear your sacred thread. The Brahmins should not wear your thread. You should not have your long hair. You should not have some of that stuff, and you should dress sort of like regular people. I mean, this is the message that they were telling the employees of East India Company. They were not telling Indians to do that. They were saying East India Company employees should actually do this. Now, East India Company employees were naturally terribly upset at that, and you can't have your employer telling you to change your religious practices, and that's what led to the mutiny there. So next, fact or fiction. When British rule began, India was one of the wealthiest nations, and when it ended, India had become one of the poorest nations. Is this true? This is a claim that is widely made. And the answer is yes, actually this is true. It's very true. So if you look at the share of GDP, India's share of GDP in 1700, before the British began ruling, was 24.4% of world GDP. And by 1950, when Britain left India, we had diminished to 4.2% of world GDP. Now, keep in mind that 1700s, India actually meant included Pakistan and Bangladesh, of course, whereas 1950, it would not. So that is some slight difference. But broadly, you can see that the share has come dramatically lower. Now, the other observation I would point out here is that in 1700s, the Indian share of world population was actually very similar to this, was almost 24-25%, which means that in 1700s, India accounted for 1/4 of world population and also accounted for 1/4 of world GDP, which means that on a per capita basis, Indian GDP per capita in India in 1700s was exactly the same as it is for the world average, which means there might have been some people like Europeans who were actually ahead of India, but there would also be other parts of the world where the average was lower. So net, India was actually on par with the world. What really happened is that from 1700s onwards, the world went ahead fast, but India did not. That is a real tragedy here. So that's actually what you see in this slide. Throughout 1820, 1870, and so on the last row, you can see India's GDP per capita barely grew during colonial times, whereas the British, American, all of those grew very rapidly. So you can see that India, yes, India's share of GDP diminished, it's true. That was not so much because India was getting poorer. India actually did not get poorer. Per capita GDP actually remained flat. So it's not that India became poorer. It is just that others were racing ahead and we did not race ahead. We were left behind because of that. So we did not go back in absolute terms. We went back in relative terms. Next one, fact or fiction. India's exports to Britain fell and imports from Britain grew when the British rule began. This is the classic exploitative cycle that people talk about. Is this true? And the answer is no, that's not true. In fact, across 1600s and 1700s, India's exports to Britain actually grew up at that time. The time when India's exports to Britain came down was actually around 1815. You can see that on the bottom chart here on the right side. It's around 1815, 1820 that the composition of trade completely changed direction. Now, of course, the two charts are not on the same axis. You can see that on the left side, you've got in thousands and right side, it's in millions. So these are not the same number. But in 1814 on the left side, British exports to India was less than Indian exports to Britain. It's actually later on that the thing switched. But again, I think the point we made earlier was that 1815 is when the Napoleonic Wars ended, and that's when Industrial Revolution really took off in a huge way. So it is not true that Indian exports to Britain fell after Britain began to rule India. That's not true. Indian exports to Britain fell only after the Industrial Revolution. After Industrial Revolution, how do you compete with the factory-made cloth that is probably good quality and very cheap? You can see the Industrial Revolution timelines on the left side of the chart. Various components like the steam engine were all invented in the late 1700s. So which also means that when the British took over Battle of Plassey, when the British took over control of Bengal after Battle of Plassey in 1757, there was no steam engine. You didn't have all this stuff. There was no Industrial Revolution at that time. There was nothing for them to export to India. Next one, British policy towards India was inhuman and exploitative. Is that true? The answer is yes, it was very true. This is a book written by an ex-employee of East India Company in 1772. The guy's name is William Bowles, and he went back to England after his stint in India, and he wrote a book exposing some of the horrors and dangers of British rule in India. And it's quite tragic to read it. I mean, it's very disappointing. Think of it. I mean, these are our ancestors. These are poor people who never really seen foreigners, never really had an interaction with them. They were living peacefully in India as they did for centuries, doing their own thing, farming their crops, doing their own occupation and livelihoods. And all at once comes these foreigners and they begin to rule India, and the cruelty is unbelievable. So, and what can they do? There's nothing they can do. It was really quite terrible. And not only did Britain take control of the Diwani, the tax collection, they were also the rulers of the country. So you can't even appeal to anyone. And normally during Mughal times or any other times, if something doesn't work well, you can appeal to the emperor or to the king, and sometimes good things might happen. Or if the law enforcement machinery creates trouble, you can complain to someone else and you might get some benefit. But here, during British rule, they effectively combined the tax administration with the police function. So there's no one that you can complain to, which is quite tragic. And this again is one of those staggeringly inhuman comments. There was a big famine in Bengal in 1770, where almost one-third of the population died. Let's stop there for a second. Can you think of a famine where one-third of the population dies? I mean, that's the monstrosity that we had in India at that time. But that's not Britain's fault. I'm not saying that the famine is the Britain's fault. But what I would say is the British fault is, look at the comment after that. After the famine, Warren Hastings, who was at that time the governor of Calcutta, wrote to his bosses saying that, okay, one-third of the people died, but the good news is that our tax collection actually has increased. Again, stop there and think for a second. The drought is so severe, crops have failed, cattle have died, one-third of the people have died. There is economic activity has practically come to a standstill. In that unbelievably tragic circumstance, these guys are able to extract tax that is not just comparable to last year, it's even more than last year. How do you extract tax from people who are starving and dying? One-third of the population has died. And the guy goes and tells his bosses that, we've actually, I'm proud to say that tax revenues are higher. I mean, of all the inhuman things that have happened in the world, this is just staggering. Yeah, about free trade and so on. So in the interest of time, let me move ahead. I came across this interesting report called the Madras Torture Commission report. I had actually not heard about this at all until I began my reading. So apparently, the use of torture by British East India Company's employees who were asked to collect taxes, that was so inhuman that message eventually filtered to the British Parliament, and the British Parliament was sort of forced to take action and appoint an investigative committee. But the investigation was a sham. It was a sham because the 3-member committee were all East India employees. So how do you get East India Company employees to go and investigate their own company? It's a sham. So the committee conducted its investigation. They spoke to British East India Company employees, and they all said, oh no, there's no torture. I've never heard of torture. There's no torture at all. And then they spoke to the natives, the people who were actually tortured, and they were all saying story after story after story, saying how the British East India Company would come there to collect taxes. And if you don't pay tax, you will be beaten, you will be tortured, you will be asked to stand in the hot sun carrying a rock on your head, and you'll be asked to do that from morning to evening until you are dehydrated and tired and you collapse. And then again, you'll be asked to do that until you agree to pay the taxes. You have to sell off your property, sell off your jewelry, sell off whatever you have to sell, but you have to pay tax. If you don't pay tax, you will be tortured. Now, the picture on the left, of course, is not from that time. I think totally different picture that picked up from it. Please ignore the picture. But the torture was very, very widespread. Now, interestingly, the British Commission created a report saying that all this is the fault of the Indian employees of East India Company. It's not Britain's fault at all. And why do these employees do that? Because they are crooked, cruel, inhuman guys. And they were saying, in fact, this is quite astonishing. The commission actually had the guts to tell the British Parliament that torture was being so easily used in India because torture apparently was part of Indian culture, it seems. And Indian people were used to torture, it seems. And that's why these East India Company employees, who were all Indians, were using torture. And Britain was able to wash its hands off of the whole thing by saying that, well, no British person has ever done this. No British person has done torture. They've never heard about it. They've never seen it. They were not involved in any way. And the East India Company employees would never use torture when the British guy was present. They would always do it when British were not present. That just tells you how nice the East India Company employees, I mean, the British people were. It tells you how nice the British people were and how cruel the Indians were. That's basically how they concluded it. The next one, this is a very sensational claim. This is a claim that I've heard very often, that the British were keen to prevent Indian handicraft cloth from competing with British manufactured cotton, and to discourage Indian cotton, they wanted to they cut the thumbs of some of the handloom weavers in Dhaka in present-day Bangladesh. And what does that tell you? It tells you that Britain was so jealous and envious of the wonderful handloom cloth made in India. It also tells you that they were so cruel that they wanted to suppress us so that they can get their own manufacturing to succeed. That's the gist of the story. And it's a widely quoted story. I've heard the story from many places. And Shashi Tharoor actually brings up the story in his book. His book, you can see the picture on the left side. It's called Inglorious Empire, where he says that at least according to one contemporary account, the East India Company cut off the thumbs of the weavers so they could not ply their craft. That's what. And why did they do this? Um, um, because the manufacturers were complaining. I think this is a very specific claim. That the specific claim is that the East India Company cut off the thumbs because the manufacturers were wanting to prevent competition. That's what the claim says. Now, Tharoor says that according to at least one contemporary account, which means this is not a very widely substantiated claim. The one guy has actually said this. Who is that one guy? There's one guy, is the same guy that we saw a few pages ago. It's William Boltz, the guy who was actually an employee of East India Company and quit and went back to Britain and wrote a sensational book saying British East India Company is a complete fraud and inhuman and blah, blah, blah. So this idea of cutting thumbs is only mentioned in one book. I have not seen this in any other book. So one has to treat this with a lot of caution. And what does he actually say? This is the exact page from his book, the 1772 book. It actually says, if you notice the bullet points on the left, it's not that the British cut the thumbs of people. What happened is people cut their own thumbs, it seems. And why did they cut their own thumbs? Because these were weavers who were being forced to work for Britain. They were not given a choice of not working. They were forced to work, but they were not being paid very good salaries. They were forced to accept really low salaries. So it's almost bordering on slave labor. You're a weaver. You would have wanted to weave and make cloth for someone else. The British tell you, no, you have to make cloth for me. But we won't pay you what you want. We will pay you what we feel like paying you. So you're forced to do this work, and the rate of payment is very, very low. And the weavers were so upset that they cut off their own thumbs. That's the story here. By the way, it's not weavers, actually. The specific book actually says the winders of raw silk. Those are the people who cut off their thumbs. And it's not the British, it's actually they themselves who cut off the thumbs. That's what the story says. So it is a very horrendous story, obviously, and it talks a lot about how the British were exploiting India. But it's not right to say that the British cut off the thumbs. That's not substantiated by any direct reports of this. There's no document available, as far as I know, that actually supports that story. And the other point is, why would you cut off the thumbs of the weavers in 1757 or 1760 when there is no industrial revolution, there's no manufacturing in England, there are no textile mills in Lancaster, Birmingham, Manchester, nowhere. There's no manufacturing in Britain. Then why would you cut off the thumbs of the weavers? What are you trying to trade then? There's nothing to trade. Britain had very little stuff to export to India before industrial revolution began. They were buying Indian cotton, selling it over here in England and making a profit. So if the sole means of wealth for British East India Company before industrial revolution was to purchase these valuable goods from India, if that is the way they got wealthy, why would you cut off the thumbs of the weavers? The story makes absolutely no sense from a history perspective. Remember, William Bolt's book actually came up in 1772. In 1772, the guy says that someone's thumb was cut. This is before industrial revolution. If you are a trader importing things, if you're a British trader importing goods from India, and this is before industrial revolution, and you kill off the weavers or destroy the weavers, then what are you importing? To me, the story makes no sense from a history perspective. Okay, going on, next story. Shashi Tharoor says that railways were actually very good for India. The train helped improve communication, transportation, brought India closer, created a much better growth opportunities for the hinterland, blah, blah, blah. It's a very well-known story. All of us know that. But Tharoor makes a very interesting claim. Tharoor says that the railways were actually good for Britain, very good for Britain. And the British built the railways not so much so that they can actually improve India economically. It was partly for military reasons, so they can move their army around and keep controlling India, but also because they wanted to extract more profit out of India. Why? In two ways. One, according to Tharoor, one was that the British, the engines, the bogie, the compartment, the railway lines, everything was imported from Britain. So the British manufacturers made a profit on that, firstly. Secondly, the railway company in India needed a lot of money, and that money was being raised from Britain. And the investors in the railway, the British investors in the Indian railway, were guaranteed very lucrative payments for doing so. So Britain was actually able to siphon off wealth from India in two ways. One, for the manufacturers of these railways, and two, for the investors who funded the railways. This is the claim that Tharoor makes. So let's see how true that is. So what I was able to find was that the British were actually not keen on building the railways in India. And apparently they did not want to build railways in India because, according to British thinking, the profitability of a railway line depends on the population density of a region. In areas like Britain, where they actually had their own railways in England, the population density was very high, which means there are a lot of cities all cramped together. So when you build a railway line, a lot of people can travel, and then that becomes very profitable. They felt that, for example, northern part of England, which is Scotland, northern part of UK, Scotland, is very fragmented. The population is not very dense. There, the railway wouldn't make sense according to their thinking. And likewise, they thought that in India, because there are large distances between India, where there is, rural areas with the low population density, they thought railways wouldn't work in India. It might work for a small country like England, or at least the southeastern portion of UK, but not in India. That's what they're thinking. So at least what I'm seeing is that it is not as if the British were making a very big conspiracy saying, hey, how do we bring railways to India and squeeze the people? That was not the way they were thinking, according to my research. And it's true that the government guaranteed 5% returns for people who invest in the bonds. So if you want to invest in the Indian Railways, we'll give you 5%. That's a very attractive deal. But unfortunately, what you find is that when the railways were actually built, they were making a loss. And because the Indian Railways were making a loss, the British government had to guarantee them profits, so they had to pay a lot of money. So initially, the railways were not very profitable. So instead of the profits being used to pay these guys, the government had to pay these guys. And where would the government pay these people from? It's from the taxes raised from India. So the Indian taxpayers were actually paying this money to British investors. And why was it making a loss? Because construction cost exceeded expectations. You can see the paragraph on the bottom. The cost per mile was £20,000 versus the estimated £12,000. And why did the construction cost go up? Because everything had to be imported from England. Remember, this is happening in 1850s, before the Suez Canal. So before the Suez Canal, you had to actually go around Africa and come here. So every single thing used for the railway had to come from huge distances, so the cost is very high. And on the one hand, the cost is high. On the other hand, the revenue was lower than expected. So together, they made a loss for decades where the British government had to pay. So this is what Tharoor says is the exploitation where, money is being siphoned off from India to British investors. But what I found also was that the idea of paying guarantee to railway investors was not unique to Britain at all. It was actually quite common around the world. In fact, it was done in Argentina, Russia, Brazil. Many countries had these similar guarantees. And in Argentina, the rate of guarantee was 7%. Why? Because they're very far away from the European areas, and you have to transport these things to a long distance. So it does seem to be the case that you have to pay these kind of guarantees to attract investors to pay money for the for funding the railways. And 5% doesn't seem to be like a scandalous amount compared to what others were doing. At least you can't build an argument saying that this was a deliberate, calculated ploy to exploit India and siphon off the wealth by paying the investors. That does not seem to be true here. Next one. This is the question that I personally find fascinating, that you can actually find out if British rule was good or bad for India by comparing areas of India that were directly under the British rule with areas that were under the Indian princely states. So like Travancore was a princely state. It was not directly ruled by Britain. They had a regent in Travancore, and they exercised a veto over several things in Travancore, but beyond that, they did not interfere with Travancore. And Travancore had to make yearly payments to Britain. So apart from making payments, and apart from having a regent in Travancore, or resident, I'm sorry, not regent, resident, apart from having a resident in Travancore who could veto some of the decisions, apart from that, they did not interfere. So if British rule in the rest of India, like Bengal, was oppressive and exploitative, would you not find that the economic conditions in princely states are actually wonderful, and the economic conditions under British areas are terrible? Because remember, we saw the earlier chart that the Indian GDP was 24% of world GDP, and it came down to 4%. So if all this decline is because of British presence, then you would expect great economic underperformance in the British areas, and you would find fairly robust performance economically in the princely states, right? Isn't that what you would find? But when I look at the data, I find, first of all, that there have been very few studies on this. So this is actually very disappointing. I think this is a fascinating topic for study, and I'm somewhat perplexed as to why there has not been enough research on this topic. At the same time, the data that has been published is actually very scanty. So I'm not very happy with the data that I'm going to show you in the next few slides, but I must say this is a very intriguing area for research. So the first one that I found is by an Indian author from Harvard Business School, where she finds that the economic aspects were actually superior in British areas. So let's wait for a second and think what it means. The areas under British control in the 1800s and so on, when you look at their economic performance today, in the 1950s, they were actually doing pretty well, very well, in fact. They were doing better than the princely states. That's an interesting topic, right? Why is it that areas that were previously under princely states actually were not doing so well by the Indian independence, 1950s? And by 50s, actually it's the British areas that were doing very well. Why would that be? That sort of defeats the thesis that we just made. The thesis was that British rule was so exploitative that areas under British rule would be in misery, and areas that were under the more enlightened princely states would be flourishing. That's what one you would expect, right? But that's not what the data says. The data says that by 1950, by independence time, it's the British areas directly controlled by Britain that were actually doing fairly well economically, is what it finds. So why would that be so? It's not clear, but perhaps there are two directions in which one could think. One is that the British made a calculated decision to invade and directly rule those areas of India which were anyway wealthy. So they deliberately cherry-picked the right areas to rule. And the areas that were not so wealthy, which were really quite backward economically, they did not want to rule directly, and they just left it for the local king to rule. And those are called princely states, where they would appoint a resident and they would collect some tax, and that's it. They would not directly interfere. So it could be that the British have done cherry picking. That's one way to look at it. The other is that the British rule, in spite of all the crazy, perverse, cruel, obnoxious things that the British did, somehow economically did not do all that badly. They actually did pretty well. These are the two outcomes that you could think of. Which one is it? And the answer is, I don't know. I have no idea, because the data does not seem to be clear. As I said, it's a very intriguing topic, but the data is not clear. By the way, let me also point out, while the economic performance of the British areas were good, the social performance were terrible. But again, I should not say terrible, because both of these were not statistically very significant. It's not like a dramatic difference between the two. So the princely states, many of them were actually very progressive. Like you can see the bullets on the top. The native state of Mysore carried smallpox vaccination before the rest of British area did. Travancore had free primary education in 1817. Swathi Tirunal, emperor and king, not emperor, king. Swathi Tirunal, king of Travancore, set up the first English medium school for students for the first time in India. So a lot of these progressive things were done by the princely states. And now in that article, this is the same Harvard Business School article, I also found this intriguing data point that the taxation rates in native states were apparently higher than the British area. So in the British India, if you look at the bottom bullet points of this page, in British India, the taxation was 2.47 rupees per person per year. And in native states like Travancore and Nizam, Hyderabad, and all those areas, the taxation rate was 3.42 rupees per capita per year. That is somewhat surprising, right? You would expect that there is a general expectation that the British were more exploitative. You would expect that British taxation was higher than the taxation with the princely states. The data seems to suggest the opposite. Now, again, I would caution that this is not a reliable finding. I think there is a very serious shortage of books and articles, or maybe there are a lot of books I just didn't see them. I just found this article, and I think we should be a little careful with this finding. Okay, next topic. Is it true that the British drained from India a very large portion of India's wealth? I think this, of course, is the crux of the whole economic argument here. Is this true? How serious was this? How serious was it that the British drained wealth from India? Let's look at that. So I begin with quoting from my favorite author, Shashi Tharoor. He says that the British extracted from India approximately 18 million pounds per year from 1765. And I must say that this 18 million pounds is a staggering figure, and it's not actually come through in any other books. I think Tharoor is fairly unique in making this claim. I think this is an extraordinary claim. 18 million pounds is very high. The grandfather of all this calculation actually is Dadabhai Naoroji. He's the one who first made a calculation of how much British were draining money from India. And he wrote this book, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. These are all public documents. By the way, most of these documents that I've listed in my presentation, they're all public domain stuff. You can buy them, you can just download them. They're all free PDF. So Dadabhai Naoroji's book used some interesting math, very complicated math, very unusual math. I would even say very suspect math. He used a lot of suspect math to come out with an argument that Britain is actually draining 3 million pounds from India. So those of you that are interested in economics and public finance would want to just go through these numbers carefully, because I went through those bullet points, and you can see the bullet points that are written here. And I must say, this is a very strange way of calculating things. If I were recruiting a finance manager in my company, and the guy does this kind of math in my company, I would seriously entertain doubts on his competence. But anyway, so anyway, Dadabhai actually concluded that British were draining 3 million pounds per year from India. There's one more author, Ramesh Dutt. He says that the colonial drain from India is 1.3 million pounds. That's a different number. And according to many authors, Ramesh Dutt is an Anglophile, and he's one of those guys who believes that the English empire is a wonderful thing. So they tend to doubt what he's writing, and they tend to believe that his figures are biased. But what he has done is, his calculation is that after all take all the tax revenue the British have received, then there's a surplus that they get. They spend money on military, they spend military on salaries and several other things. After all expenses are met, if you take the total revenue that the British had, subtract all the expenses, you'll be left with their surplus. That surplus is actually what they take to Britain. But how do you take the surplus to Britain? You can't just carry rupees, Indian rupees, anna and paisa and all that. You can't take that to Britain, right? So what the British apparently did is, they would use the surplus and call it investment, which means they would actually buy Indian cloth with that. And this cloth they would then take to Britain and then sell it there and make a profit. So the surplus tax revenue that they get, that is tax revenue minus expenses, they would use that to buy cloth in India, and that's what they call investment. And that's what you see in this page, the data on the right side. So Ramesh Dutt has calculated investment over several years and taken an average and said that the average is $1.3 million, 1.3 million pounds, British pounds, is the amount that they used to buy cloth in India and send that to Britain. And if you take cloth worth 1.3 million pounds from India and sell it in Britain, probably you can sell it in Britain for maybe 2 times that, 3 times that, 4 times that. So you might be Britain might probably be getting not 1.3 million pounds, but 3 million pounds, 4 million pounds kind of wealth they would get. But of course, while Britain has got a net gain of 3 million pounds, out of that 3 million pounds, the true drain from India is only 1.3, because the remainder, if you look at it, is actually the consumer surplus, right? It's not actually the drain from India. The Indian colony has actually not lost 4 million, it's actually 1.3. So that's what you see in this slide. There's one more author, Niall Ferguson. If you guys have not seen this guy, you should actually listen to his videos on YouTube. He is a professor of history at Harvard, Stanford, many other places. I don't know where he is right now, but he's quite a celebrity in history circles. He's what is considered a conservative historian, which means that he's one who believes that, make Britain great again kind of thing. Now, I don't want to misrepresent what he's saying, but I think he's one who believes that the British colonial experiment was actually a very good thing. And it had a lot of good things. Now, he doesn't turn a blind eye towards the bad problems of British colonialism, but he does not shy from celebrating the successes either. So if you look at the rest of British media, they generally tend to be fairly shameful of the colonial past, and they generally admit that the colonial experiment was very inhuman and exploitative and sort of uncivilized thing to do. So that's what the British politicians and population generally says, but not Niall Ferguson. Niall Ferguson is, taking a lot of trouble to explain to the world that, hey, colonialism was not all that bad. So his argument is that the British drained 1% of India's GDP every year. And he also says that Britain invested very large amounts of money in India, 400 million pounds by 1880, which is like a huge amount of money. And that actually helped improve wealth and prosperity in India, he's trying to say. So trying to say that it's not completely one-sided exploitation. Also, the British helped build something in India's times. I think there is some truth to that, of course. Now, here is my personal representation of what I've seen. So, if you recall, Dadabhai Nauroji says that the drain from Britain, the drain from India to Britain, is 3 million pounds per year, and over several periods of time and so on, the total drain that they had is 13% of our export is what they've taken. So don't take the drain as a percentage of GDP. That's not a really good thing in my view. Take a more accurate figure, which is the drain that they had, the amount of money that Britain took from India, and divide that with the exported value of Indian goods. So that's what you see on the left side. $144 million of exports of the drain divided by 1.1 billion British pounds. So the ratio is 13%. And then according to Ramesh Dutt's method, the drain is 4%, 48 million divided by 1.12 billion. So which means if you just go by these two authors' methods, Britain, for every 100 pounds that Britain exported from India, they stole 4% to 13% is what these authors say. Now, how bad is that? How good is that? How bad is that? How do we judge that and say this was really incredible exploitation, or this was actually not all that bad? So now this is the value judgment. This is not a matter of science. This is a matter of politics, and this is a matter of personal opinion. So my personal opinion is that one could look at some of the data on the right side. That is, American software companies today spend 14% of their revenue in marketing. Marketing cost is 14%. What is the average sales and marketing cost for Indian IT outsourcing companies like Infosys and Cognizant and others? My understanding is that it's between 5% to 15%. It will be astonishing to find any Indian outsourcing company where their sales and marketing cost is less than 5%. Also, conversely, you will never find anything that is more than 15% because that is just a crazy way to run business. So let us say 5%, 10% all seems to be within the realms of possibility, even today. In spite of having all this wonderful communication, transportation, email, fax, all this, you still have to spend 5 to 10% of your revenue to drive marketing. So given that, if in 1700s and 1800s, when India was not well integrated with the rest of the world, if there are people who come and trade from India and take 1.12 billion pounds of exports out of India, and then they steal 4% or 13% of that, would you call that ruinous? Would you call that exploitative? Would you call that catastrophic? Would you call that bad? Would you call that slightly bad? What would you call it? My conclusion is it's bad. It's clearly bad. There's no question on that. But I don't think it's as bad as some people make it out to be. Like, if for every $100 of exports from India, if someone takes away $30, I'll say, man, that is crazy. If someone takes away 20, I'll say that's terrible. 15, it's still bad. But when you take away something like 10%, 4%, 5%, I'm not sure that rises to the level of the criminality that people accuse this to be. So my other point on the drain, I think that people who discuss drain, in my view, fail to distinguish between three kinds of drain. And these are three different things. And we need to distinguish between them because they're actually not all the same. The first type of drain is called the loot, like the Kohinoor diamond, the peacock throne, all these diamonds, jewelry, all that. They just take it away to Britain. Now that is complete theft. There's no argument about it. That's the worst kind. The second type is what they call investment, which is you have $100 of revenue, tax revenue that Britain gets here, of which they spend, let us say, $80 on various things. $20 is their profit here. And that $20 they use to buy cotton, and then they go and export the cotton to England and sell the cotton there and make some money on that. So that 20 is money that is leaving India. So that is what they call investment. The third one is remittance, where the soldiers and employees and the governor and all these employees of East India Company and the British rule, they get fancy salaries in India, and then they save some money, and then that money they send back to Britain. And that is being treated as a kind of drain from India. Now, I would argue that the third one, that is remittance, is very questionable as a drain. Like I'm an American citizen now, but until let's say 2 years ago, I was an Indian citizen staying in America and working in America. And some of the surplus money that I get from America I send back to India. Is that a drain? Is that an exploitation of American economy? Is that really a bad thing? All of our Indian friends who stay in the Middle East or UK or other countries, they spent billions of dollars worth of money back to India. Is that really a drain? Are we saying that Indians staying in Saudi Arabia are draining the country? I think that is a questionable argument. So I would say that loot is a clear-cut loot. The one on the left is clear exploitation. The one on the right, remittance, is sort of dubious. I'm not even sure it's really a bad thing. Now, investment is in between, somewhere in between. So again, I'm just saying that one has to distinguish between them because you can't just paint them all with a white brush. Next one, the British wanted to promote British business in India, so they discouraged Indian industrialists and traders. How true is that? Now, I don't really have much data on this, but I just wanted to point out that the Parsis were one group that were very actively working with the British and did a lot of astonishing things. Like Parsis were involved in shipbuilding since the 1700s, apparently. So I say this just to say that it's not the case that the British were trying to crush all Indian businesses and just give space to British businessmen to do business in India. That's not true. There were a lot of Indian businessmen as well. So were the Indian businessmen discriminated against? I think so, clearly yes. Were they discouraged? Yes. Were they banned? I don't think so, because there are a lot of Indian businessmen even in those times. So I think it is true that the British were discriminating against Indian business. There's no argument on that. But I think my worry is that some of the people who say this argument have actually gone too far to the other side in exaggerating the amount of oppression that the British had. So I don't have full data on this, but I'm just cautioning everyone, saying, don't go overboard in listening to what some of these authors say. I don't think they are presenting the whole picture. By the way, the book on the left is an interesting book. The author is Kartar Lalwani, who has written a book about the glorious story of British enterprise in India. Now, his book has been widely criticized for being like a British apologist book. He's trying to say that British Empire is a wonderful thing and British are all angels and, it was all a wonderful time. So this book starts off with the premise that Britain is wonderful. So I think, you could argue that he's done a lot of cherry picking. He's deliberately taken all the positive sides of British rule here and deliberately excluded all the horror stories here. So again, this one is not a free book. You have to, it's Kindle, you can get it. I would not recommend buying this book. It's like a propaganda material for British industry. Some of the first manufacturing units were also set up by Parsis. We talked about that. So again, I think the story that the British were trying to crush all Indian businesses, I would say the general drift of the story is right, but I think it glosses over a lot of specifics that are not. Next one. Once the British came to India, the Indian cotton weaving industry began to collapse. Is that true? I think we've seen this before. It's not true. Like, there is this story mentioned in Niall Ferguson's book about how in 1663 there have been shopping expeditions in England that people talk about, where everything that you see there is all full of Indian stuff, Indian cloth, Indian calico, Indian silk. So Indian products were quite the rage in England at that time. And for every Indian item that you see in England, remember, it actually is generating wealth in India. There are people who are getting jobs in India. And it was actually creating a boom in India. In fact, the boom was so severe that Murshidabad, Bengal, which is the place where a lot of this export happened from, was actually the wealthiest part of the Mughal Empire. Remember, the Mughal Empire was so large, it ruled over practically all of India, well, most of India. And they had all these very fertile areas like the Gangetic belt, Ganga Yamuna belt. We had all these wonderful agricultural areas. But those were not the wealthiest parts of the Mughal rule. The wealthiest parts of Mughal Empire actually was Bengal, not because of their agricultural wealth, but because of the trading. All this cotton growing, cotton weaving and silk textiles and so on. So it's trade that made Bengal wealthy. It's not agriculture that made it wealthy. Interesting point. Shashi Tharoor also says how, the trade actually increased Bengal's textile and silk production by 33%. So trade was clearly beneficial for India. There's no argument on that. Fact or fiction, British oppressed Indian businessmen and Indian businessmen disliked the British. So what is a popular stereotype? The popular stereotype is of a Tata or a Birla or someone else in the British rule trying to set up a company here and being discouraged and prevented by the British, and you feel really depressed because you're not able to do business here because the British are against you. So all the active businessmen of India were hating the British because the British were such cruel oppressors. That is a popular story, right? How true is that story? Again, from the way I'm framing that, you can guess that I'm trying to say it's not true. So the reality is a little more complicated. So I hope some of you have heard of this guy called Jagat Seth. Jagat Seth is a financier in Bengal who actually supported the British in the Battle of Plassey, and he was one of the people responsible for the Battle of Plassey turning the way it did. So the interesting question is, these are Baniya Hindu traders, right? Why would they support the British? Because they were actually being oppressed by the Mughals and the Nawabs. So that's an interesting point. So these are businessmen who saw that the Mughals and the Nawabs were not very business oriented, and they were not really the best opportunity to make money. The best opportunity to make money are these big European traders, because that's where the wealth comes from. So that's why these guys were supporting the British at that time. Now, of course, in India today, Jagat Seth is considered a traitor, right? Because he supported the British against the Nawab, and he is the one that led to the Indian defeat in the Battle of Plassey. The entire English rule in India began with Jagat Seth's support for Britain, right? But I think we need to think a little more. Why did these traders actually support the British? Because that tells you that the Mughal rule actually was not very conducive to trade and was not very conducive to business. Next one, the Baniyas in Surat. Surat was, of course, a British factory. They had a trading post there, and was also part of the Mughal Empire. The big businessman there was a guy called Virji Vora. He was considered one of the richest businessmen in India at that time, in the 1600s. He's a Jain, apparently. So this Jain businessman actually was very friendly with the British, and he used to provide finance to Britain so they can buy materials. Remember, the British actually needed to buy goods in for months together, because the ships take 6 months to sail from Britain, right? So when the ship comes, they want to be able to load everything. You had to start buying up stuff months in advance, keep it all ready in your go-down, and wait for the ships to come so they can, load it up in the ship. So you have to have a lot of working capital to buy up all this material and keep it in your go-down. And that required funding that people like Virji Vora would provide that, these Jain businessmen. Now, interestingly, what I found is that these Jain businessmen were actually friendly with the British, because on the one side, these guys were getting oppressed by the Muslim Mughals and their local guys, and on the other side, they were getting oppressed by the Hindu Marathas. So just think of the irony here. The Muslims and the Hindus are together oppressing this Jain guy who becomes a friend of the British. I think the irony is incredible. If you look at the last paragraph, you'll see here that Surat's Qazi forcibly circumcised a Baniya and made him convert to Islam. And the guy was so ashamed of himself, of this inhuman stuff, that he went and committed suicide. And in protest, a lot of the Baniyas actually left Surat and they moved somewhere else. And eventually, a lot of them actually came to Bombay. Remember, Bombay was actually just a group of fishing villages. There was nothing in Bombay. Bombay was not a city. Bombay was a city that was built entirely by the British. And it was a magnet for free enterprise. The Parsis, remember, when the Parsis actually left Iran because of Islamic oppression, they actually came to Gujarat. I think it was Valsad or Vapi or somewhere else that they landed. And from there, they actually moved to Bombay. Bombay was like a magnet for the Parsis, for the Jains, for the Baniyas. A lot of the businessmen came to Bombay because it was a perfect place for business. And this is an intriguing story that that the Hindu Shivaji would go and attack them, take away all their wealth. The richest businessman in India, Virji Vora, actually became bankrupt guy because of Shivaji. Actually, he attacked Surat twice and took away the guy's wealth. Calcutta and Mumbai actually were created from scratch by the British. We know that. Okay, next one. The British land revenue collection system created huge misery for Indian farmers. Is that true? The answer, of course, I'm sure you can guess, is it's very true. It's very, very true. Um, in fact, before the British came upon their permanent settlement system, I think anyone who studies Indian history would have studied this thing called permanent settlement system that Lord Cornwallis set up in India. And there's something else called the Rayatwari system, which again was from the 1820s. So before these were set up, initially there was a period of trial and error where the British made mistakes in India. And one of those mistakes was this idea about appointing a zamindar by auction. So after 1765 or 1764 Battle of Buxar, when they gained control of Bengal, they decided that let's auction off the land for the zamindars. Whoever pays us more money can become the zamindar. That's what they tried. And that was a disaster. Why was it a disaster? For 2-3 reasons. One, that if you are a good zamindar and you know that you can raise $100 of tax from this place, but you are worried that if you quote $100 to the British, they will not give you that thing. So you have to quote $120 to the British, so that you are likely to get the auction. But you know that the people can't pay $120 of tax. They can only pay $100 of tax. You know that. So what do? If you're an honorable, ethical, decent zamindar, you have two choices. One, you quote $100, which is a reasonable amount, and then you will not get the contract to be the zamindar. Or you quote $120, which you know is actually not the right amount because you can't collect that. Or you have to be cruel with the people, exploit them, fleece them, beat them, and torture them and get money from them. And then you might get the contract. So what would you do? You will be debating about this. You will be ethically torn between this. And then you will find some shady, slimy, crooked guy coming there and bidding for the same thing. And he will bid $150. Does he think that he can actually get the money from these people? He doesn't care because he's not a zamindar who's got a long-term commitment, right? So you will find all these unethical, shady characters coming in and bidding for this amount. And they're bidding vast amounts of money. The place cannot give a tax more than $100. There are people quoting 140, 150, 200. They quote any ridiculous amount. And the British had no idea how much to charge, right? So they will just go with the highest bidder. And the highest bidder in this kind of situation almost always means disaster. It's disaster for the people, disaster for everyone. So that was a terrible thing that happened. But there's one more consequence. If you are the zamindar in perpetuity, you will try to encourage cultivation in newer areas. You'll try to improve the economy of the state because then, a lot of the wealth will come to you. But if you are a guy who's got a contract for 2 years, 3 years, whatever short-term duration, why would you even bother? You don't care about what happens to this place after 5 years. You got a farmer who's struggling to pay the money. You torture the guy and get money from him, get the wife to sell the jewelry, get whatever money they have. The guy has got some seeds that he's planning to plant next year. Take away the seeds from him. That's what you would do if you're a shady, unethical guy. Now, this farmer whose seeds you've taken away, what is he going to do next year? How is he going to have crops next year? You're less worried because you know that the British might actually take away your zamindari and give it to someone else. So it encourages a short-term thinking that is incredibly bad for the country. So these were some of the revenue settlement systems that the British introduced. Permanent settlement in 1793 when Cornwallis was the governor. Rayatwari in 1820, mostly in Tamil Nadu and Madras in Bombay, and Mahalwari in some parts of Punjab and other places. There are 3 different land reform settlement types. Now they all have their pros and cons, but I think it's a very fascinating story. In fact, Rayatwari in 1820 was considered an improvement over permanent settlement. Permanent settlement was actually considered a noble idea because now what happened is in 1793, British basically appointed zamindars forever. You are told, you are the zamindar, you'll be the zamindar forever. Your tax will be $100. You have to always give us $100. And there is something called a sunset clause. Sunset clause means that on that day of the month when the tax is due, you have to give us the tax by the sunset of that day. If not, you will be instantly removed from the zamindari and we'll appoint a new zamindar over there. So the sunset clause was a very dreaded clause. But that's what a permanent settlement basically is. But once you are a zamindar and you know that the tax is $100, it gives you a lot of predictability and permanence. Now you can actually try to encourage more farmers to cultivate. You can get the marginal areas under cultivation. You can build tanks and canals to improve irrigation. You can try to improve the seeds and so on. So any improvement in revenue, let us say the tax revenue goes up from 100 to 120, the British will only get 100. Tax revenue is fixed forever. British will only get 100. If the economy booms, if more taxes collected by the zamindar, he can keep all the difference. So zamindars have an incentive in trying to improve economic conditions in their state. That's why the permanent settlement actually was considered a fairly good method. Now, Rayatwari was where the British would directly deal with the farmers. Rayat means farmer in some, I don't know what language that is. So the direct dealing with farmers is the Rayatwari, and that was considered an improvement over the Zamindari because why do we want to make this middleman rich is the argument. That's why they directly dealt with the Rayatwari. And if you remember this thing called the Madras Torture Commission report, that happened in Rayatwari. Rayatwari actually was common in Madras and Bombay, Madras presidency and Bombay presidency. So in Madras, parts of Madras presidency, where the British were directly dealing with farmers and getting taxes from them, this is where they use that East India Company employees to go and beat up and torture and do cruel treatment of those people to extract the tax. So from that perspective, even though Rayatwari is considered generally an improvement over permanent settlement, the Madras Torture Commission experiment tells you that Rayatwari was not all that great. Now we've seen all this from the Indian perspective. How about from the British perspective? The huge profits from the Indian trade must have made the shareholders of East India Company very wealthy, right? It's like getting a share of, Amazon or some other company at the pre-IPO levels, and then you become incredibly wealthy, and then you can have all these nice yachts and fancy bungalows, right? That's what it means, right? Let's look at what it actually says. Now, here's an interesting data point that I found. Did you guys know that the most valuable company in human history ever was actually the Dutch East India Company? And there was a fleeting moment in the 1600s or so. I think this is during the Tulip Mania bubble. During the Tulip Mania bubble, the Dutch East India Company shares were astronomically quoted so much that in today's wealth, in today's prices, it will be worth 7.9 trillion. How big is 7.9 trillion? By comparison, Apple is less than 1 trillion. Microsoft, Amazon, all these guys are less than a trillion, 800, 900, $700 billion worth today. So even the biggest companies today are less than a trillion, but these guys were like 7.9 trillion at one point in time. Now, of course, the Dutch East India Company was eclipsed by the British East India Company, who became even more powerful than that. But I thought this is a very interesting data point. So here's a chart showing the East India Company's share price. East India Company was set up on December 31st, 1600. It's an interesting date. December 31st, 1600 is the date when East India Company was set up. And each subscriber actually pulled in 100 pounds to form the company. And eventually the company was dissolved after 1860s or so. And all of East India Company's monopoly and trading rights all vanished by 1813 and 1833. So practically East India Company sort of languished into obscurity after 1833. But over this 250 odd years, their share price actually doubled from 100 pounds in 1600 to 200 pounds when the company was practically wound up. So they made a decent profit, right? But look at what the opportunity cost was. If you consider the opportunity cost, that 100 pound in 1600 should have been worth several thousand pounds by 1800s. And did you get several thousand pounds? No, you actually got 200 pounds. So I would say that of all the tragic characters of the Indian colonial experiment, I would say the East India Company shareholders were also among the tragic characters here. I think this is a fact that we don't appreciate so much, that these guys were actually poor souls who got crushed in this experiment. Okay, so the shareholders did not actually gain much from East India Company. So perhaps the British government would have gained a lot, right? The government would have got a lot of tax revenue and they would have got a lot of money from the East India Company, right? The answer is no. The East India Company was a perpetual drain on the British government since the 1770s famine and later on time period where they had to have a lot of expenditure. East India Company has been perpetually in debt, perpetually trying to get money from Britain, British government, and they would plead with the British government year after year for help. And eventually things got so bad that in 1773, the Britain had to pass the first law connecting India to the Regulating Act of 1773. And that's soon after that Warren Hastings becomes India's first Governor General and so on. And then they had, the Pitt's India Act of 1784 and so many different acts got passed. And the acts got passed because British East India Company was so badly managed. You can see the comment in the first paragraph. 1773, the Prime Minister says, the company is better administered by the Crown that is so ill administered by the directors who are incapable of governing it. So it is not right to say, that East India Company was a wonderful thing for the government. It was not. What about employees of East India Company? Could it be that they became very wealthy? The answer is yes, that's very true. So this guy, Clive, I think we talked about him a little earlier. Clive was a guy who actually was, how do you describe him? He was a rowdy in his youth. He was considered to be the guy who, in today's world, would be the kind of guy who would get drunk and get into fights with the friends and go to police and have a criminal record, in your teenage years. That's kind of rowdy he was. And if you look at Clive's adventures in India, they're incredible. There was a battle with Dupleix, the French guys in Madras, where the British were certain to be defeated. But this guy, who was actually a clerk in the British Army, British East India Company, he was not a military guy at all. But he was just naturally aggressive by nature that he requested a transfer from a clerk job to a military job and decided to plunge into that battle with the French, where everyone had given up hope. They thought it was a hopeless situation. He jumped into the situation. There was a fight about Nawab of Arcot, who is the right Nawab descendant. Is it this guy or is it that guy? French supported one guy, the British supported the other guy. There was a fight between them. All messy politics locally. But Clive jumped in. He was a very, very young guy. He jumped into a situation and astonishingly was able to defeat the French over there. And that is basically what turned French interest in India down. If it were not for that, we'd all be speaking French today. So the French experiment in India basically got crushed by Clive in 1700. It's called the Carnatic Wars, the Nawab Wars at that time. And then his next experiment was the Battle of Plassey. Again, nobody actually thought that they would win, but it was his personal conviction, charisma, courage, and aggression that actually made Britain win the Battle of Plassey. Nobody thought it could happen, but it was just Clive's willpower that made them do it. But as a result, at a very, very young age, the guy got a lot of money. He received 234,000 pounds of cash from the Nawab. He got a Mughal title. He was personally conferred the Diwani of Bengal. He was made a Jagar personally. Actually, I'm sorry, let me correct it. The Diwani of Bengal actually went to East India Company, but he was made a Jagar himself. And he got a lot of wealth. And he came back to England at the age of 35 as one of the wealthiest people in England. And then he went and bought a castle, he bought an estate, he got a title, he became Sir Clive. I think his exact title was Baron Clive. And the area that he bought his land, he called it Plassey. So his title became Baron Clive of Plassey, that's his title. And he became part of the British nobility after that. And in spite of all the crooked, cruel things that Clive did, he personally faced no consequence for all that. In fact, Clive's story is such a remarkable story that when the Battle of Plassey was going on, if you remember, there was a conspiracy between Mir Jafar, who was the guy that the British were trying to create as a puppet to become the Nawab. The British were conspiring with Mir Jafar, and they had a friend called Amir Chand, a Hindu trader, who was actually on the British side. And then Jagat Seth, one of the richest people in Bengal at that time, was also supporting British. So think of it, conspiracy between Amir Chand, Jagat Seth, two Hindu traders, and then you have Mir Jafar, who's the puppet that they're trying to install as the Nawab of Bengal, and Clive on the one side. On the other side, you have the old Nawab Siraj-ud-Dawla, who's actually a very young guy, by the way, but he's the traditional Nawab. So this is the conspiracy. And then Amir Chand, the crooked Baniya trader, actually tries to come up with a last-minute tactic. He goes and tells Clive and others, guys, I'm having second thoughts. I will continue with this conspiracy if you guys pay me more money. If you don't pay me more money, I'm going back to the Nawab Siraj-ud-Dawla. I'm going to tell him that you guys are conspiring against him. And imagine what would happen. These are all traders, remember, right? I mean, these British guys were traders, not really a big military force at that time. What would happen if Amir Chand, this Hindu trader, goes and tells the Nawab Siraj-ud-Dawla, hey guys, these British guys are conspiring with Siraj-ud-Dawla, this guy Jagat Seth and team. If he says that, what will happen? Very likely, some of the British will get killed. Very likely, almost certainly, Jagat Seth is going to get killed. It's going to be, the conspiracy would be crushed even before it started, right? So Clive comes up with one of his crooked stories. So Amir Chand is crooked, trying to double cross this guy. And Clive comes up with one of the most interesting stories of senior management treachery and crookedness that I have come across. What Clive did is, he wanted to placate Amir Chand and say, listen, no, we'll agree to what you're saying. No, don't worry. Don't spread our story. Don't go and tell the Nawab. Let's proceed with our story. You want more money? Fine, we'll give you more money. Now, of course, Clive had no intention of giving more money to Amir Chand because the guy was basically blackmailing them, right? So what did Clive do? What Clive did is, he created two agreements. One true agreement, which is actually between Jagat Seth, Mir Jafar, and British. No Amir Chand. They cut him out of the deal. That's a true agreement. They also had a fake agreement done to placate this guy, Amir Chand, where he was made one of the co-signatories there. And then the fake agreement, they needed the British governor's signature there. And Clive, of course, was not a governor, he was a senior guy. So Clive actually forged his boss's signature there because the boss had actually signed the true document. The true document did not have Amir Chand's name because Amir Chand tried to double cross them, right? So trying to cut him out of the deal. So the true agreement did not have Amir Chand's signature. Clive created a forged agreement, put Amir Chand's name there, and he forged his boss's signature and went and told Amir Chand and said, okay, we're agreeing to your demands. You wanted more money, we're giving you more money. Here's the agreement, signed agreement, keep it, be happy. Don't tell the Nawab about our threat. And then the battle got over and everything is over. And then they won. There's a new Nawab. The British became victorious. Everything is wonderful. And then Amir Chand comes to meet Clive and says, okay, now give me my money. And Clive actually takes out the true contract and says, this is the true contract. The contract that we gave you is actually a fake contract. And after hearing that, the story is that Amir Chand actually collapsed. He had a heart attack and died, it seems. That's the story. So that's the level of treachery that the British were operating in. So you see, and when did this happen? We're talking 1757. So this is when the English Enlightenment was going on. This is when the British philosophers were doing their wonderful philosophy. This is when, the great Enlightenment thinking was going on. So on the one hand, the British would talk about very enlightened, sophisticated theories about how to deal with the world. And here you have Clive establishing British rule in India through a forged agreement. And this is the guy that eventually became one of the wealthiest people in England, and became Baron Clive of Plassey. And eventually, later on, the tide turned. Later on, the British Parliament understood that there's a lot of injustice going on in India. They set up an inquiry commission, and Warren Hastings got impeached, and I'll talk more about it. And all that happened. Eventually, Clive became quite an object of disapproval in England, and the guy eventually committed suicide. So Clive is the one who did all this mischief, but who is the one who paid the price? It's unfortunately his success. It's actually Warren Hastings who faced all the punishment. So Warren Hastings actually got impeached. So what happened is that there was a big uproar in British Parliament against the bad deeds of the British in India. So there was a public outcry saying we should actually take action against them for all the cruelty that they're doing in Bengal. But how do you punish these guys? These are not British government employees, right? They're a trading company. They're a private independent company. This is like Dhirubhai Ambani and Reliance, right? And how can you take action against them? What can the British government do? They've not broken the law, right? So having no other redressal mechanism, the only thing that these guys could do is they could actually call these guys for impeachment in the parliament, which is a very strange way of doing things, The parliament impeachment is not designed to take action against private companies, but having no other opportunity, the conservative faction of the English Parliament, that is Edmund Burke and others, they actually impeached this guy, Warren Hastings, who was the Governor General at that time. And the impeachment went on for 7 years, from 1788 to 1984, 1788 to 1794, 7 years. British Parliament was engrossed in this extremely rare proceeding. And there's a picture, you can see the picture on the right side of the slide. The Parliament Hall was overflowing. People were actually paying money to get a chance to come in and see this because this is such a rare sight. You have one of the greatest orators of Britain, Edmund Burke, coming and denouncing this guy, Warren Hastings, with all kinds of flowery oratory that you could use. Look at the text on the left side. I'll send you these slides later. You don't have to read it now. But Edmund Burke's speech denouncing Warren Hastings is like a masterpiece of English literature. And what was the joke here? The joke here actually was that Warren Hastings actually was not a bad guy. He was actually a good guy. And unfortunately, the good guy got caught up in all this. And initially, all of public sentiment in England was against Warren Hastings, saying, how could you be so cruel? How could you bring disgrace to the English name by doing these bad things in India? That's how the impeachment began. But within a few years, people realized that this was actually a completely misguided adventure. And Warren Hastings, the perception was that Warren Hastings was both cheating the company and cheating the people of India. But people of India actually wrote to them saying that actually no, because Clive was doing all the bad stuff. Warren Hastings actually was a very kind, nice guy. So over a period of time, after more and more evidence got added on, it became clear that this impeachment was actually a mistake. And eventually the British Parliament voted against the impeachment. So basically Warren Hastings was not impeached. He actually was left completely innocent. And the impeachment just fizzled away after 7 years and just came to a stop. But in the process, a good man's reputation was tarnished, and it was just unfortunate occurrence in British history. And Warren Hastings actually was a good guy. Why do we say he's a good guy? Because he came to India at the age of 17 from a poor family, worked his way up the ladder of the East India Company, and eventually became, the resident in Bengal and later the Governor General of India and so on. And he was like a friend of the Indian people in the sense that at that time there was a fight between what is called the Orientalist faction and the Anglicist faction. And the Orientalists actually were people like Warren Hastings who believed that India has a glorious history and we should be courteous and respectful for Indian history. And he encouraged, more research into Indian history and Indian religion and so on, and Indian practices. And on the other side were these Anglicist faction who believed that India is a horribly backward place, and we have to bring the sunshine of Western civilization to destroy all the medieval backward practice of India. So that is a fight between the Orientalists who respected Indian past and the Anglicists who opposed all that and wanted to bring in English law and English customs and English traditions. So in that fight, Warren Hastings was an Orientalist. He actually was a friend of he was one of the people who actually helped set up the Asiatic Society of Bengal. And when he was the Governor General, he supported this guy, Charles Wilkins, to translate the Bhagavad Gita in 1785. That's the first Western translation of the Gita, which actually became very popular, got translated into so many languages. So the Western fascination for India actually began with that translation, which actually was supported and funded by Warren Hastings. So in that sense, Hastings actually is a friend of India in that sense. And the poor guy didn't deserve this kind of public humiliation. And at the end of the impeachment, he was actually let free. But in the process, the guy actually lost all his money. Now, the tragedy is he actually did not loot India. He did not take a lot of money from India. But whatever little money he had taken was completely spent in the defense of this impeachment. The guy was left totally broke at the end of it. Whereas the crook who really took all the money was this guy. And of course, he did not face any consequence to that. So to come back to the question, yes. So if you look at it, the English East India Company shareholders actually made no money. Their money doubled, where it should have gone up like 1,000 times. So, they lost out heavily, and they did not gain. What about the British government? No, they also did not gain. They were actually having to perpetually fund the East India Company. So it's actually the employees of East India Company who really became very, very wealthy with this. And by the way, unlike the Dutch East India Company, and unlike the French, and unlike the Portuguese, East India Company was the only European trading power that actually allowed its own employees to trade as they wished. It's called private trade. You can do your own private trade. So you come to India as an East India Company employee, your salary is pathetic. It is just enough to survive. And you're away from home, and approximately 1/4 of all of these East India Company employees would actually die of disease because all these strange diseases going on in India, these guys don't have the immunity and they will die. And it's very hot, there's no air conditioning, and of course all of that. So very high mortality rate, very low salary, you're separated from your family and friends, a ship passage will take 6 months, you're cut off from your home country, and your salary is pathetic. The only way you can survive and you can do well is to trade on your own. So you go and buy things on your own account and go and sell it in Britain using the same ship, the East India Company ship, and you could actually get very wealthy. That's what these guys did. I think we've run out of time heavily, so let me now go through the rest very quickly. Profits from the Indian colony were hugely important for British manufacturing. Would it be right to say that the British industrialization effort was really funded by Indian colony profit? Is that true? There is such an argument, and Shashi Tharoor actually makes that argument. Is that true? So one argument that I saw was that the drain of wealth from India to Britain represented 30% of British domestic savings that is used for capital formation, which means that 30% of the money that they used to set up all these factories and all those things actually came from the drain from India. It's an interesting argument. In that sense, yes, it is true that we actually paved the way for industrial revolution. Then colonies' wealth might have raised British GDP by a significant amount. That's the other argument I've seen, which is true. Now here I found a contrary point of view. The contrary point of view is that trade with India made Britain wealthier, and that would have increased GDP by 3.3%. You can see the chart there, 3.3%. Plus, the British investments in Indian enterprises that are British-owned enterprises in India, which is not from making profits, like shipping and ports and railways and all of that, made profits, and the profits will go back to Britain, which again helped raise British GDP. But on the other hand, they needed a huge military here and salary costs here to control all this. And that cost was a drain on their GDP. So net, the British economy did not really gain much from this, is the argument. Again, is this the right argument? I don't know. I don't know that. I'm just presenting this to you because I happen to see this as part of my research. And lastly, I saw this argument that the title of this article is, was it worth having the British Empire? Was it worth having the British Empire? And this guy, Patrick O'Brien, says that colonies were actually a drain on the British Empire, and the GDP of Britain would have been higher if they didn't have the colonies. Again, I don't know if it's true. I'm just presenting it to you. What about public opinion in Britain? What did they think about British rule? So this is what Adam Smith, the father of capitalist thinking, this is what he had to say. What would Adam Smith talk about this? Adam Smith was violently opposed to colonial rule in India. Why? Because colonialism, if you remember, was a monopoly. If you remember, the British East India Company was a charter given by the Queen of England to this merchants from London to trade in India. It was a monopoly. And Adam Smith is a supporter of free markets. The concept of a monopoly is just deeply something he couldn't agree with. So he was opposed to this. He was saying that this is, look at the second paragraph, they are nuisances in every respect, always more or less inconvenient to the countries in which they're established, and destructive to the people who they rule. So Adam Smith was highly opposed to this because it's not a free trade. And we know that, right? It's not a free trade at all. This is what John Stuart Mill had to say about Indian imperialism. John Stuart Mill, one of the greatest thinkers of England, one of the greatest thinkers of the Enlightenment period, was actually an employee of the East India Company. He lived his whole life as an employee. And he actually said that gave him a lot of free time to write his books and develop his thinking. But he never wrote anything on India. He never wrote anything on colonialism. And the little that he wrote actually are very offensive stuff. Look at the stuff that is written on the right side. People of India are of a lower degree of civilization, and the rules of ordinary international morality do not apply to these barbarians in India. And their minds are not capable of so great an effort. And it is for their benefit that they should be conquered and held in subjection by foreigners. Remember, this is the guy who wrote a book called On Liberty. He's the father of libertarian thinking. And the guy says it's actually perfectly fine that you should rule India because these guys are not really human beings. It's astonishing how, on the one hand, you can be a supporter of liberty, and on the other hand, you can support colonial rule. What about our friend Karl Marx? Karl Marx actually had a conflicted position on India. He used to write very prolifically in New York Daily Magazine, the Daily Tribune magazine in America. And he was based in Britain, remember. This is a German guy who was sitting in Britain, where Britain was actually gaining from Indian trade, and his articles were actually in America. And his position was, British rule in India is bad. They're really creating trouble in Britain. It's actually inhuman. They're creating trouble in India. And yet it's actually good in a way, because you're destroying the religion, you're destroying the caste system, you're destroying all that stuff that is holding India back, and you're creating the foundation for a strong capitalist rule. Think of it for a second. Why is Karl Marx, who denounces capitalism at every stage, why is he supporting capitalism in India? Because in his view, a country like India can become a truly communist country only when you go through capitalism. Because from the old feudal rule that you had in India, you cannot become a communist country. To get into communism, you have to first go through capitalism. So it's a very interesting argument. It's a very strange argument. He's celebrating that the capitalist, imperialist, colonialist exploiters of Britain are crushing India. He's celebrating that because in his view, it's a painful but necessary step so that eventually communism can flourish. One day revolution will come, but for that, I need Britain to go and rule India. That's what he basically says. The other comment about Marx, I think a very, very similar comment, he's saying that English imperialism in India actually is the greatest social revolution ever heard of in Asia, he says. Now, modern British media, of course, is very deeply ashamed about British rule in India. This is my last section. Is it true that the loot from India is what actually made Britain such a wealthy nation? My first comment is this. We often forget that the British were already a very powerful force when they came to India by 1757. Look at the timelines. Magna Carta, the first control on monarchical absolutism and despotism was actually Magna Carta, 1215. The Reformation, setting up the Church of England, breaking with the powerful Vatican, happened in 1533. English Civil War in 1642, when the Parliament had an upper hand, and then something called the English Glorious Revolution of 1688, when the guy from Holland, Netherlands, was actually brought in and made the King of England by the Parliament. So the Parliament could actually dictate who becomes the king. That happened in 1688. So these things happen in 1600s, the Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. Isaac Newton, Scientific Revolution, 1687, Principia Mathematica. John Locke and English Liberalism and Enlightenment, 1600s. Great Britain was formed as a union of England, Scotland, Wales, 1707. So all these very powerful things had actually happened in England by then. And we often just look at this one number saying that Mughal rule, under the Mughals, India actually accounted for 24% of world GDP. So we were such an awesome country. We were so great. We were wonderful. And then the British just happened to defeat us, is what many people in India say, especially the right wing. But wait for a minute. Why do you say that if you are 24% of world GDP, how is it that these tiny amount of people from this faraway island could travel several thousand miles into the sea, taking 6 months to come here, and just easily crush the empire here? How did that happen? It happened because they had a lot of strengths which you're not recognizing. By just harping on this fact that India had 24% of GDP, you're sort of failing to recognize that we actually did not do a lot of these things that Britain actually had done. So that's what this slide says. Next slide, neo-institutional economics. I think this is the economic theory that says that good institutions lead to high income levels. Good institutions meaning, things like right law, control of corruption, and so on is actually what leads to better wealth. It's not about what money you loot. I think if you guys have not heard of this theory called neo-institutional economics, I think you should read up about it. It's actually very fascinating. Now, here is a slide. I think I'm coming to the end of my presentation, but here is a slide that I just want to point out. If you say that colonial rule is what made India poor, just look at Britain. It is one of the most colonized country in the European area. Just look at the map of Europe. There is almost no country in Europe that has not invaded UK. Vikings actually covered a part of England and ruled there, after the Roman Empire fell and before the Norman invasion. Norman invasion of 1066 is where the current dynasty actually comes from. The Romans actually ruled England in 43 AD. Anglians came in the 5th century after the end of the Roman Empire. Saxons came later from Germany. That's what you call Anglo-Saxon. So when you say Anglo-Saxon, the Angli is not in England, actually from Belgium area. Saxon is in Germany. So Anglo-Saxon actually is not English. And a lot of what you see today is all Norman, that is actually from France. And when you say Norman, actually these are Norsemen. Norsemen meaning they're actually Vikings. They're actually Viking descendants who settled in Normandy, and they are the ones who actually ruled England. So, and the Spanish Armada of 1588 actually is a very interesting story. Huge amount of ships from Spain, the world's greatest superpower at that time, coming to attack England. And England very, very nearly fell under Spanish rule. And if that happened, we'd all be speaking Spanish today. But narrowly, the weather interfered, and there's a storm. The ships all got lost, and they went and crashed somewhere, and Britain escaped. And that was actually one of those miracles of coincidence. If that had not happened, world history would have changed. Because Spain was actually truly superior to Britain at that time. So this is the country that got ruled over so many people by a long period of time. And that did not really make them poor. I think we are overplaying the story that India is poor because these guys ruled over us. That's a very simplistic argument. Look at the Spanish experiments. Spain ruled over Americas, but Spain did not really become rich. And lastly, this is my last slide. The Persian king Nadir Shah plundered India. He took away more money from India than what the British took over in all of the 1700s. The Peacock Throne, Kohinoor Diamond, all this he took away. And what did that make Iran? Iran is not at all any wealthy. So I think the idea that foreign rulers coming and ruling India and becoming rich is a very simplistic story. That concludes my slides. And I know I've taken way more time than I expected. So with that, let me stop and see if anyone has any questions.
നമുക്ക് ഇത് ബ്രിട്ടീഷ് റൂൾ എന്ന് പറയാൻ പറ്റും, കോർപ്പറേറ്റ് റൂൾ എന്നല്ല പറയാൻ പറ്റും. Most of the time.
Yeah, but it was a British monopoly at that time. The British Queen had given a charter to East India Company, and they were allowed to use British troops to support them. So, in theory, yes, it is actually a British company and not a British government. But they were continuously supported by the British Army. They had the support of the British Parliament. They were constantly running in losses. They had to be funded by the British Parliament. Many of the shareholders were actually British MPs. So, you're right. Officially, you're right. It's actually the company and not Britain.
Actually, it's Dutch East India Company. അതല്ല ആദ്യം വന്നത്. അവരാണ് കൺവേർട്ട് ആയി ബ്രിട്ടീഷ് ആയത് അല്ലേ?
So the Dutch East India Company was actually set up before the East India Company, the English East India Company, yes. But they were eclipsed by Britain later on.
ഏത് ഇയർ ആക്ച്വലി ബ്രിട്ടീഷ് കിങ് റൂൾ ആയത്?
After the mutiny of 1857.
1857 വരെ ബ്രിട്ടീഷും ഇന്ത്യൻസ് ഒക്കെ ഇന്റർ മാരേജ് ഒക്കെ ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു കേട്ടു. അതിനുശേഷം അവർ കോൺഷ്യസ്ലി അതുവരെ അങ്ങനെ ഒരു പ്ലാൻ ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു കേട്ടു, ഇന്റർ മാരേജ് അങ്ങനെയൊക്കെ. പിന്നെ 57-ലെ റിവോൾട്ടിന് ശേഷമാണ് ആ പരിപാടിയൊക്കെ നിർത്തിയെന്ന് കേട്ടു.
So my understanding is that the British actually were intermarrying with India. Broadly, I think the direction that you're saying is probably right. I think so, because Orientalist time, when Britain was discovering that India actually did have a culture and civilization and so on, that time was when many of these British guys, some of them got married to Indians and so on. So yes, there was a lot of appreciation and respect and courtesy and so on at that time. Things got more hardened after 1857, and then a big gap. And the story is that the first guy who came, I think his name is Thomas Moore or Henry Moore or something, the first British envoy from England who came to India in I think 1608, he came to the Mughal Empire, and he was trying to plead with the Mughal emperor, saying that, can you please give us a farman, approval to trade with India. And the guy was actually made to wait for 2 years because he would not get an audience with the emperor. He can't even get an audience with the emperor for 2 years. And the guy was advised to just remain in Agra. So he remained in Agra, waiting for a chance to speak to the emperor. And eventually people tell him, be patient, you have to bide your time. This is the emperor after all. And he was advised to take an Indian wife. So he actually took an Indian wife. I think it's an Armenian lady, I think. So he got married, he settled down here, and then after 2 years, he decided, okay, this is not going to happen. And then he went back to England with his Indian wife. So yes, I think all that happened before 1857.
തരൂരിന്റെ ഒരു കമന്റ് കണ്ടായിരുന്നു, ഇത് ബ്രാഹ്മിൻസുമായിട്ട് ഓറിയന്റലിസ്റ്റുകൾ ഇന്ററാക്ട് ചെയ്താണ് കാസ്റ്റ് ഇവിടെ ഫോം ചെയ്തെന്നുള്ളത്. അതിനുമുമ്പ് കാസ്റ്റ് സിസ്റ്റം അത്രയും വേഴ്സ് ഫോമിൽ ഇന്ത്യയിൽ ഇല്ലായിരുന്നു. പിന്നെ ഓറിയന്റലിസ്റ്റുകൾക്ക് ആകെ ഇൻഫർമേഷൻ കിട്ടിക്കൊണ്ടിരുന്നത് ബംഗാളി ബ്രാഹ്മിൻസിന്റെ നിന്നാണ്. അങ്ങനെയാണ് ഇത്രയും വേഴ്സ് ആയ ഒരു കാസ്റ്റ് സിസ്റ്റം ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നത്. അതിനെ പറ്റി എന്തെങ്കിലും ഞാൻ ഇടയ്ക്ക് ഡിസ്കണക്ട് ആയി പോയിരുന്നു, അറിയില്ല അത് മെൻഷൻ എന്നുള്ളത്.
ഇല്ല, അത് മെൻഷൻ ചെയ്തിട്ടില്ല. സോ ബേസിക്കലി എന്റെ പ്രസന്റേഷനിൽ ആ സോഷ്യൽ ആസ്പെക്ട്സിലേക്ക് I didn't want to get in because I wanted to just remain on the economic aspect. But generally, ബ്രിട്ടീഷുകാർ വരുന്നതിന് മുമ്പ് കാസ്റ്റ് എന്നൊക്കെ പറഞ്ഞാൽ അതൊക്കെ ഒരു ഇൻക്രെഡിബിളി സ്റ്റുപ്പിഡ് ഐഡിയ ആണ്. That's not preposterous. അത് നമ്മുടെ സംഘി പ്രോപ്പഗാൻഡയാണ്. സംഘി പ്രോപ്പഗാൻഡ പറയാറുണ്ടല്ലോ, ഈ കാസ്റ്റ് എന്നൊക്കെ പറഞ്ഞാൽ ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് എ റെസ്പോൺസ് ടു മുഗൾ ഇൻവേഷൻ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഇസ്ലാമിക് ഇൻവേഷൻ. ഇസ്ലാമിസ്റ്റുകൾ വരുന്നത് വരെ ഇന്ത്യയിലെല്ലാം നമ്മുടെ മനുഷ്യരെല്ലാവരും ഒന്നുപോലെ, എല്ലാം ഒരുപോലെയൊക്കെ ആയിരുന്നു. ഇതൊക്കെ മുഗളന്മാരും മുസ്ലിങ്ങളും വന്നുകൊണ്ടാണ് നമ്മൾ ഇങ്ങനെ ആയത്. ഇതൊക്കെ വെറുതെ പറയണത്. ഇറ്റ്സ് ഓൾ ബ്ലേറ്റന്റ് മിസ്റെപ്രസെന്റേഷൻ.
മുഗൾസിന് മുമ്പ് ഉണ്ടായിരുന്ന ഇസ്ലാമിക് റൂളേഴ്സ് അല്ലായിരുന്നോ?
മുഗൾസിന് മുമ്പ്
മുഗൾസിന് മുമ്പുണ്ടായിരുന്നതും ഇസ്ലാമിക് റൂളേഴ്സ് അല്ലായിരുന്നു. മുഗൾസും വേറെ ഇസ്ലാമിക് റൂളേഴ്സിനെ തോൽപ്പിച്ചില്ല, അവര് ഡൽഹി എടുത്തത്.
Yeah, you had from 1000 AD, you had Mahmud of Ghazni, Ghori ഒക്കെ വന്നു. അതിനുശേഷം you had Delhi Sultanate. അതിനുശേഷം you had the Lodi Empire. And Mughals വന്നത് 1526 Battle of Panipat. They deferred the Lodis to become the emperor. So yeah, we've had We had Islamic rule in India for half a century before the Mughals came. In fact, one of the stories that one of the stories that I personally like, I find fascinating, is how Islamic rule spread so incredibly fast. Muhammad, his time is early, the first part of the 7th century, right? 622, Muhammad in a time. But within less than 100 years, the Islamic Empire had conquered incredibly large amounts of the world. Like the attack by the Muslims to India, Sindh province, by the late 7th century, early 8th century, they had already conquered Sindh. By 700, how much Sindh they had conquered? It's unbelievable. They had conquered 3 of the world's greatest civilizations: the Egyptian civilization, the Iranian civilization, and the Turkish civilization. 3 of the world's most incredibly powerful civilizations the Islamists conquered. No, not all in 7. Turkish, of course, happened much later, but still, it's astonishing how after the Roman Empire, when the world was in dark ages, it's the Islamic Empire that was like a beacon of light in that time and became such an incredibly powerful military in such a short time. In fact, the rule of Islamists in Spain, they conquered all of Spain actually. This happened in the year 711. So, it's an easy way to remember. If you go to a 7-Eleven shop in America and see a Spanish guy working there, remember this. 711 is the year when Spain was conquered by the Moors. What they call Moors basically is Moroccans, North Africans. In 711, they conquered all of Spain, which is less than 100 years after Prophet Muhammad's time. And they built such a wonderful empire in Cordoba and, Alhambra and Al-Andalus in Spain. It's incredible. And they were very liberal people. They were not the popular perception that today that we have of the Taliban type, Saudi Arabian type crazy guys. These were actually people who really liked learning philosophy, poetry, architecture. They were genuinely liberal. They were welcomed by the Spanish, because the Spanish at that time in 711, after the fall of the Roman Empire, they were a Roman colony. After the Roman Empire fell to the political vacuum, they actually invited the Islamists over there. It's not like they had to attack and kill. Actually, one way to make a lot of people angry is to talk about the glory of the Islamic rule of Spain, because at one shot you're going to make the Spanish people upset, you'll make the Indian Sanghis upset, you'll make Donald Trump upset. A lot of people are going to get upset over it. And even the Saudi Arabians don't like it because, the hardcore Islamic types today do not like the kind of liberal Islam that actually existed in 700s at that time.
Crusades were they were very peaceful and then they had to be brutal to survive.
That's an interesting thought. I didn't hear that. Okay. That's something to think about. Actually, even in Saudi Arabia was a part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. And it's after World War I that the Middle East actually fell under British and French rule. Palestine and Israel and after that. Even until the end of World War I, Middle East actually was a very liberal place in fact, the Ottoman Turkish Empire actually was very liberal. They were not like the Saudi Arabian crazy guys. So in fact, if you look at the broad swath of history, you should say that the kind of extreme Islam that you see today is actually an aberration if you look at all of history. The Turkish Empire was so liberal at that time, and that's why they were able to conquer parts of Eastern Europe. Albania is Muslim, right? So, and many other parts of Eastern Europe are actually Muslim because Turkish guys were not so crazy at that time. They, of course, it's hard to imagine any part of Europe being colonized by the Muslims.
British India concept strong.
No, that's not true. Sanghi right-wing propaganda. There's a Sanghi right-wing propaganda that India. No, let me circle back. I think there is one argument that India was all fragmented and the British unified us. But the corresponding counterpoint to that is that Mughal rule actually ruled over huge parts of India, except for some tips of South India and so on. Mughal rule actually was very comprehensive. Ashoka's rule was very comprehensive and very large. Marathas, see, British rule in the last rule, see, Britain defeated Tipu Sultan in 1795. Then Britain defeated Travancore 1795. Travancore, not Travancore 1795. They conquered large parts. The last empire that Britain really conquered in India was actually the Marathas in 1880. That's the definitive. No, but Marathas were very large at that time. The Maratha Empire stretched all the way from Pune, all the way. They were actually attacking the Nawabs at that time in Bengal. And then they actually went all the way to Afghanistan. And the Marathas also were controlling parts of places like Tanjore and so on. So think of it. Tanjore in the south, Pune and Bombay on the west, Bengal and Orissa in the east, and Afghanistan in the north. That's how big the Marathas were. So what I'm trying to say is, it's not true that the British politically unified India. We actually did have very large empires, Mughal, Ashoka, Marathas, and so on, which actually were huge. So that's not true.
Sorry.
Okay. Alkar Mansil was Kinginodal allegiance was national feeling. Another feeling in British.
I don't know enough about that. So that's a political question, and I haven't looked into that. As I said, I've been focusing more on the economic aspect.
Partha, do you want to go through the chat section? There
are a few questions in the chat section.
Sure.
Yeah, I think Manu was asking something.
Yeah, initially Samir was asking a few questions and Manu shot a couple of them. Then I did. I guess my question is what Samir brought up just now.
Clive resembles Narendra Modi plus Narendra Modi. That's a good one. Princely states tax collection. So I told you there's not enough data on princely states. In fact, princely states is a very fascinating area to compare because then you can truly distinguish between British rule versus princely. There's not enough data on that.
Taxation that I mean better I don't know land revenue like taxation strict like approval other subject princely said any better like our Molakaram Mishakaram Vidubada taxation number travel other compare who are better.
So, that article says that the British tax rate in India was actually 2.4 something rupees per person per year, which is lower than the average taxation in the princely state, which was like $3 rupees something. So, there is some argument, some evidence, at least in some limited context, that the taxation rate of the British was actually lower than the princely state. Now, I must say that I find that very surprising. I would have expected that British taxation is more oppressive than the local princely. That's what I would have expected, but I'm surprised if the data actually says something else. To me, that is perhaps just an aberration. I think this requires more research. I think I would be shocked to find that that is truly the case.
Okay. British East India Company British ruler was that like very cruel like before?
No, it's actually the other way around. Let me say this. British rule, after the impeachment of Warren Hastings, Britain publicly began to understand that you had these bad problems here. They were very conscious of it. They tried very hard to control it. So it is true that Britain really recognized their mistakes and tried to take corrective action after 1788, Warren Hastings' impeachment session. Because Parliament is telling them that, how could you do these things? They're asking the East India Company. So there is no tolerance at all from Britain saying you should do these bad things. Britain was never interested in that officially. Unofficially, people will still do that, but officially they never would do that. That's 1788. They had all these laws, Regulating Act of 1773, they came up and those acts were trying to bring in more control. And after the British rule of 1857, that's generally considered a very socially stable time when the laws were very strict and uniform laws. There is no despotism, there is no anarchy, there is no, arbitrary rule. The rule is actually much better. So I would say that the British social, legal, regulatory framework was consistently improving year after year. And things like General Dwyer, Jallianwala Bagh, they're all exceptions. I think for every exception like General Dwyer, my view is, you can find there are exceptions in India too, right? You have Indian police who would mercilessly fire protesting Indians, right? Unarmed Indian protesters, there are police who fire them. So I don't think there's any merit in saying that British rule is bad because of the Jallianwala Bagh. I don't think British actually, there is nothing in British policy that says Jallianwala Bagh was the right thing to do. In fact, everything about the British rule actually says there's a due process, there is a rule of law, there is a tradition. They've tried very hard to create a legal framework that is reasonable. Whereas at that time, most of the Indian rulers were despotic. There's no legal framework, there's no penal code, there's nothing. Everything is for the king and the zamindar to decide as they want. One fine day you wake up and you decide you don't want to do this, and that's your new law. So
that itself tells me that India will disintegrate without the British.
okay, there's some more comments of what is this?
ഒരു സ്ലൈഡ് ഞാൻ നോട്ടീസ് ചെയ്തിരുന്നത് സ്റ്റേറ്റ് വേഴ്സസ് ബ്രിട്ടീഷ് സ്റ്റേറ്റ്സിന്റെ കാര്യത്തില് ഇപ്പം കേരളവും തമിഴ്നാട് നോക്കിയാൽ ഇൻഡസ്ട്രി പക്ഷെ അത് നോക്കി ഹൈദരാബാദ് ഒരു എക്സെപ്ഷൻ അല്ല എപ്പോഴും.
Sorry, I couldn't hear. There's a lot of background noise. Could you say that again?
നമ്മൾ ഒരു സ്ലൈഡ് ഞാൻ കണ്ടതാണ് പ്രിൻസ്ലി സ്റ്റേറ്റ് വേഴ്സസ് ബ്രിട്ടീഷ് സ്റ്റേറ്റില്. ഇപ്പം കേരളം ഒരു പ്രിൻസ്ലി സ്റ്റേറ്റ് ആണ്, പക്ഷേങ്കിൽ ഒബ്വിയസ്ലി സോഷ്യലി ഫോർവേഡ് ബട്ട് ഇൻഡസ്ട്രിയലി ബാക്ക്വേർഡ് ആണ്. തമിഴ്നാട് നോക്കിയാൽ ഇൻഡസ്ട്രിയലി ഫോർവേഡ് ബട്ട് സോഷ്യലി എ ബിറ്റ് ബാക്ക്വേർഡ്. അങ്ങനെ ഒരു കമ്പാരിസൺ നമ്മൾ എടുക്കുമ്പോൾ ഹൈദരാബാദ് എപ്പോഴും ഒരു എക്സെപ്ഷൻ അല്ല അതിൻ്റെ അകത്ത്.
Yeah. So I think it's hard to draw these inferences and take out outliers. It's very hard to do that. But one of the slides that I had actually said that the British areas were economically superior but socially backward, which means that British areas had fewer investments in schools and hospitals and things of that nature, which are social investments, social capital, social infrastructure. But they were better off in agriculture. Why would you be better off in agriculture? Because someone took the trouble to build these canals and dams and check dams and ponds and lakes and things like that. So they were more interested in money. That's basically what it shows. Whereas the princely states were interested in general quality of life and truly the fabric of a social life is what they were interested in. So to that extent, you can say that the industrial backwardness of Travancore compared to the industrial forwardness of Tamil Nadu and the vice versa, the reverse position on social indicators, it does confirm to that thesis. You're right, and Hyderabad is a whole different animal.
Yeah.
Now, if you compare Malabar with Travancore, you'll get a whole different picture all over again. Because Malabar is economically and socially backward compared to.
Chatla questions allam karinja. Partha, do you
I couldn't see any clear question. I think these questions will require more time to discuss with them.
it's more or less,
Yeah.
Okay, so I think if we don't have any more questions, then we can have an open session. If you want to hang out here, I mean, I think it's